It's important to remember the life of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. What I most recall is the circumstances during which time he was assassinated. As a labor activist with AFSCME here in the state of Maryland, I take very special pride in the fact that it was Dr. King that was called by the leaders of the Sanitation Department in AFSCME in Memphis, Tennessee. They said, Dr. King will stand with us. Dr. King will make them hear our plight. The sanitation workers have been attempting for many years to build a union and get union recognition from the city officials in Memphis, Tennessee. Now, remember, this is in 1968, not that far removed from the segregation days of the Deep South. And in Memphis, Tennessee, there's a wonderful movie called By the River I Stand about that struggle to gain recognition of the sanitation workers. And one thing that sticks out during that movie is the attitude of the city administrators and legislatures. I can say myself, it was simply a modern day slave overseer mentality. The sanitation department was made up of thousands of Black men. These men joined together with union organizers, and they saw a way to stand united together to improve their working conditions, to improve their wages, to get health and safety on the sanitation jobs. Because just a few weeks before this particular march, for the second time, a sanitation worker had been killed on the job. And what was the attitude of the city administration? It was, oh, well, sorry about that. Go back to work. Much like the attitudes of the overseers on the slave plantations. So they called in Dr. King and he marched with them. The first march broke out with a bit of disruption. I'm not going to call it a riot because it wasn't, but they were certainly attacked by some of the white supremacist organizations in the Memphis area. And there was a lot of destruction and a lot of fighting. So Dr. King felt it was absolutely necessary to return to Memphis and have a peaceful rally. That was, after all, his legacy, to have a peaceful rally. And it was during the organizing of this second march to have a peaceful rally under the leadership of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Also in attendance was the Reverend Jesse Jackson, who was very young and was just starting out Operation Push in Chicago. Dr. King organized and led that, came to lead that second march. And as he did, he was felled by an assassin's bullet. But we must remember that he had grown, his growth, the steps that he took in his earliest days marching against the Montgomery bus boycott, which was an attempt to continue to say to the Black masses throughout the South, and particularly in Montgomery, you're second-class citizens, you don't really count. Stay at the back of the bus. From there, Dr. King began to speak out against the Vietnam War. So he came out of this legacy, this vein of marching just for civil rights. He began to support voting rights. And in the earliest days of the Vietnam War, he saw how horrible and tragic that war was to Vietnamese people. He saw that no good could come of that war in Vietnam that the US was now waging against the people there. In fact, it was he that said, for every bomb that explodes in the land of Vietnam, another bomb explodes here in the cities of the United States of America. In April 1967, he gave a tremendous speech where he spoke out so strongly against the Vietnam War. And that's just my personal belief, and some others may agree with me, that that is when he really became a target of J. Edgar Hoover as director of the FBI and Operation COINTELPRO. J. Edgar Hoover said that the Black masses in the United States shall have no leadership. He had already assassinated Malcolm 3 years earlier, and Medgar Evers had also been assassinated in the South, working against segregation. So Operation COINTEL, which also in later years after the assassination of Dr. King, targeted so many of the Black Panther Party leaders around the country, including the murder of Fred Hampton, the murder of George Jackson in California, and the jailing of over 100 Black Panther Party members who today, those that are still living, still languish in the jails of the US. Dr. King stood up for justice. He ventured away from civil rights into the anti-war movement, speaking out against the Vietnam War. And now he was in Memphis to organize the workers into a union which would have the power to say to the city bosses, hey, we count. We demand that you address our grievances. We demand that you sit down at the table and discuss this with us. As I said earlier, before that, the mentality of the Memphis City Administration was a slave master, slave overseer mentality. Thousands marched in the street in Memphis, Tennessee. It erupted into violence. Dr. King said, we're going back a second time, and we're going to show that we can march peacefully and demand these rights. But the peaceful march with him never made it because he was assassinated. And I think it's important to look what Dr. King was planning beyond that march there in Memphis. He was planning a national march on Washington, an encampment called the Poor People's March that would encamp out on the Capitol grounds, bringing to Congress, right up to the door of Congress, not quite in the same way as we saw last week with the right-wing white supremacist attack on the Congress building, but right up to the grounds of the Capitol so they could see from the Poor People's March the grievances of America's poor that was being unaddressed. And he brought together poor Blacks, poor whites, and the working poor, those individuals that have a job but don't have a decent enough pay to really take care of the concerns of daily living. Dr. King was an inspiration to me because watching his growth as a leader from the early anti-segregation days on the buses, to marching across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, to speaking out against the Vietnam War, of which mostly so many poor soldiers from poor families were drafted because those families that had the money could send their kids to college and they would be given a deferment from being drafted. So it's the children of the poor and working people that were going to Vietnam and being killed and also killing our sisters and brothers in Vietnam. Dr. King saw that that was wrong, but he also saw what was being done to the poor was wrong, and that millions and billions of dollars were spent on this war when that money was severely needed for the inner cities, for the rural parts of America, from the Appalachians to the rural parts of the South that were being undeveloped. Dr. King's powerful message resonates today, some 50 years after his death. And for that, I say, I am proud to be here to honor the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. today on the date of his birth. Thank you.